My classmate kept pushing me in the hallways and faced no consequences because his dad was on the school board. I got him expelled for pushing the wrong person. I was a junior in high school, and there was this kid named Colton who thought he owned the hallways because his dad donated money for the new gym. Colton was 6'2" and played varsity football and made sure everyone knew it by wearing his Letterman jacket even when it was 90 degrees outside. He had this thing where he'd push people into lockers when he walked by just because he could. Not hard enough to really hurt anyone, but enough to make you drop your books or spill your coffee. Teachers saw it but never said anything because Colton's dad was on the school board and his mom ran the PTA. The first time he pushed me, I was carrying my art project that took 3 weeks to finish. It was a sculpture made of wire and paper, and when Colton shoved me into the wall, it crushed completely. He looked at the destroyed project and laughed, saying I should watch where I was going. When I told the art teacher what happened, she said accidents happen and I should be more careful in crowded hallways. Colton was standing right there smirking because he knew nothing would happen to him. After that, Colton made me his favorite target. Every morning he'd find me at my locker and push me into it while his friends laughed. He'd time it so my face would hit the metal door. He'd push me in the cafeteria so I'd drop my lunch tray. He'd push me down the stairs but claim he was just trying to get by. He'd push me during PE and say it was part of the game even when we were just standing around. He'd push me into puddles on rainy days and into trash cans on regular days. When I complained to the principal, Mr. Irvan said boys will be boys, and maybe I should try to be friends with Colton since we'd probably end up working together someday. Colton's pushing got worse after that because he knew I'd tried to report him. He started adding commentary when he pushed me. He'd say I walked like I wanted to be pushed. He'd say I had a pushable face. He'd say some people were meant to be pushed and I was one of them. His girlfriend Brittany would giggle and say Colton was so funny. His friends would rate each push on style and effectiveness. Other kids started avoiding me because they didn't want to get caught in Colton's pushing radius. Teachers would see me getting pushed and suddenly need to look at important papers. The janitor told me to toughen up because life was full of pushers. My parents said to ignore him and he'd get bored, but Colton never got bored because pushing me made him feel powerful. That's when I started studying Colton's pushing patterns. He always pushed with his right hand. He aimed for the left shoulder to spin people into walls. He never pushed when certain teachers were around like Mrs. Rodriguez, who didn't care about his dad's money. He definitely never pushed when the superintendent visited, which happened once a month for board meetings. I learned the superintendent, Dr. Foster, had a daughter named Haley, who went to private school across town. She was small and quiet and wore thick glasses and looked exactly like the kind of person Colton would push if she went to our school. I did some research and found out Haley volunteered at the public library on Saturdays teaching kids to read. I started volunteering there too and became friends with her over a few weeks. Haley was actually cool, and we bonded over anime and true crime podcasts. When I mentioned I went to Jefferson High, she said her mom was the superintendent there. I told her about Colton pushing everyone, and she was horrified. She said her mom would never allow that, but I explained about Colton's dad being on the board. Haley got quiet and said she'd wanted to transfer to Jefferson, but her parents thought private school was safer. The next month was the board meeting, and Dr. Foster would be at school. I convinced Haley to come see the school since she was thinking about transferring. I told her to wear a Jefferson High visitor badge and walk the hallways during passing period to get a feel for the school. I may have also mentioned that Colton usually hung out by the gym between second and third period. Haley showed up wearing jeans and a hoodie, looking like any other student except for the visitor badge. She was walking down the hall when Colton saw her. He didn't recognize her as the superintendent's daughter because why would he? He just saw a small girl with glasses walking in his path. He pushed her hard into the trophy case. Haley's glasses went flying and she hit her head on the glass. Colton laughed and told her to watch where she was going. His friends high-fived him for the solid push. That's when Dr. Foster came around the corner. She'd been coming to check on her daughter's visit. She saw Haley on the ground with a bleeding forehead and Colton standing over her laughing. She saw the broken glasses and the cracked trophy case. She saw Colton's friends still celebrating the push. Dr. Foster helped Haley up and asked what happened. Colton went white when he realized who Haley was. Dr. Foster's face changed in seconds. First, she looked confused, like she didn't understand what she was seeing. Then her eyes went wide with horror as she realized her daughter was hurt and bleeding. Then her whole expression turned to pure rage that made everyone in the hallway take a step back. She helped Haley stand up and checked her forehead where blood was dripping down. Then she turned to Colton and asked what his name was. Her voice was quiet, but somehow scarier than if she'd been yelling. Colton's face went from smug to panicked as he stammered out his name. His friends who'd been high-fiving him seconds ago suddenly remembered they had to be somewhere else and started backing away down the hallway. One of them actually turned and ran. Brittany, his girlfriend, just stood there looking shocked like she couldn't believe this was happening. Colton tried to explain that it was an accident, and he didn't see Haley in the hallway. He said the halls get crowded between classes and sometimes people bump into each other. Dr. Foster cut him off mid-sentence and asked why he was walking through the hallway shoving people in the first place. She said she watched him push her daughter hard enough to send her flying into the trophy case. She said that wasn't an accident or bumping into someone. Colton opened his mouth and closed it and opened it again, but no words came out. His face turned bright red, and he just stood there looking at the floor. Other students were gathering around watching this happen. Some had their phones out recording. Nobody was rushing to Colton's defense. The school nurse came speed-walking down the hallway with her medical bag. She took one look at Haley's bleeding forehead and told her they needed to go to the office right now to check for concussion. Doctor. Foster told Colton not to move a single inch from that spot. She pulled out her phone and called someone. I heard her say Mr. Vaughn's name and then school resource officer. Her voice was still that scary, quiet tone. I was standing about 10 feet away by my locker watching everything unfold. Part of me felt satisfaction seeing Colton finally get caught after months of pushing people with zero consequences. He looked terrified standing there with Dr. Foster glaring at him and students recording on their phones. But another part of me felt sick with guilt because I'd basically used Haley as bait to make this happen. I'd befriended her and convinced her to visit the school and told her exactly where Colton would be during passing period. She got hurt because I wanted revenge. The blood on her forehead was real. The broken glasses on the floor were real. I'd known Colton would push someone, and I'd made sure that someone was the superintendent's daughter, so he'd finally face consequences. Mr. Vaughn came rushing down the hallway looking nervous and sweaty. He was trying to smooth down his tie and fix his hair while he walked. He started talking before he even reached Dr. Foster about how hallways get rowdy during passing periods and sometimes students roughhouse. Dr. Foster held up one hand and he stopped talking immediately. She said her daughter had a head injury from being physically assaulted by a student while wearing a visitor badge on this campus. She said she wanted to know why students were being allowed to shove each other into trophy cases hard enough to cause bleeding. Mr. Vaughn opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Baptiste Howard, the school resource officer, showed up next. He was this tall guy with a serious face who usually hung out in the main office. He looked at Haley's broken glasses on the floor and the cracked trophy case, and Colton standing there looking guilty. Baptiste started asking questions to everyone who witnessed what happened. Students who usually avoided me because they didn't want to be near Colton's pushing radius suddenly had a lot to say. About a dozen kids told Baptiste they'd seen Colton push people regularly. They described incidents going back months. They mentioned other students who'd gotten hurt. Some of them had videos on their phones of Colton pushing people in previous weeks. One girl showed footage of him pushing a freshman into a trash can last Tuesday. Nobody had said anything before because Colton's dad was on the board and everyone knew complaints went nowhere. But now, with the superintendent's daughter bleeding and the resource officer taking statements, everyone wanted to talk. Colton got more pale with each new statement. Doctor. Foster told Baptiste to suspend Colton immediately pending a full investigation. Baptiste nodded and told Colton to come with him to the office. Colton looked like he might cry. His dad showed up within 20 minutes looking angry and ready to make threats. He came storming down the hallway in his expensive suit, talking about lawsuits and overreactions. Dr. Foster met him at the office door and told him they needed to speak privately. They went into a conference room and I couldn't hear what was said, but when Colton's dad came out 15 minutes later, he looked pale and defeated. He left without even looking at Colton. Whatever Dr. Foster said to him had worked. I waited until things calmed down and then went to the nurse's office to check on Haley. She was sitting on the exam table with a small white bandage on her forehead. The nurse was filling out paperwork. Haley looked shaken but okay. She saw me and gave this weak smile. I asked if she was all right and she said her head hurt, but the nurse said she didn't have a concussion. Then she asked me if that guy pushes people all the time. I felt my stomach drop, but I couldn't lie to her face. I admitted Colton had been pushing people for months with no consequences. I told her about my destroyed art project and all the times he'd targeted me and how teachers and Mr. Vaughn had done nothing. Haley got quiet and looked down at her hands. She said she'd almost transferred to Jefferson last month, but her mom thought private school was safer. Now she understood why her mom was so protective about school environments. She said she'd thought her mom was being overprotective, but turns out public schools really did have problems like this. I felt terrible sitting there watching her process what happened. She seemed genuinely shaken and kept touching the bandage on her forehead. I was the one who set this whole thing up. I'd engineered this moment by convincing her to visit during passing period and mentioning where Colton would be. I kept telling myself Colton would have pushed someone eventually anyway. He pushed people every single day. It was only a matter of time before he hurt someone badly enough that consequences happened. But I knew the truth was, I'd specifically planned for him to push the superintendent's daughter, so he couldn't escape punishment this time. I'd used Haley's trust in our friendship to put her in harm's way for my revenge. I left the nurse's office and walked to my next class with my stomach twisting into knots. The hallways felt different somehow, like the air pressure had changed and everyone could sense something major was happening. Students clustered near lockers, whispering and checking their phones. Someone said Dr. Foster had been seen leaving the building with Haley and driving straight to the district office. Another person said Colton got pulled out of third period by Baptiste, and nobody had seen him since. By lunch, the rumors were everywhere, and getting wilder with each telling. Someone claimed Colton got arrested on the spot, which wasn't true because I'd seen him leave with his dad. Another person swore Dr. Foster was calling lawyers to sue the school, which made no sense since she ran the school. But underneath all the wild stories was this current of genuine excitement, mixed with disbelief. Kids who'd been pushed by Colton for years were starting to hope that maybe this time would be different. My friend texted me during lunch saying there was going to be an emergency board meeting that evening at 6. She worked in the district office as a student aide and had seen the email go out to all board members marked urgent. I asked how she knew it was about Colton, and she said the subject line was student safety incident requiring immediate action. Word spread fast after that, and by the end of the school day, everyone knew something big was happening. The usual crowd that hung around after school actually left on time because they wanted to go home and ask their parents what was happening with the board. I went home and tried to do homework, but couldn't focus on anything except checking my phone every 5 minutes. My friend started texting me updates around 6:15 when the meeting actually started. She said all 7 board members showed up, which almost never happened for emergency meetings. Colton's dad was there looking angry and defensive, sitting in the front row. Dr. Foster presented first and apparently had photos of Haley's injury, plus statements from multiple witnesses, including Baptiste and several students. My friend said you could hear people in the audience gasping when Dr. Foster showed the pictures of Haley's bleeding forehead and broken glasses. Colton's dad tried to interrupt, saying his son didn't mean to hurt anyone, and it was just an accident in a crowded hallway. But Dr. Foster shut him down immediately and said the security footage showed Colton deliberately pushing Haley when the hallway wasn't even crowded. Then she dropped the real bomb and said this wasn't an isolated incident, and she had documentation of Colton pushing students regularly for at least 2 years. The other board members started asking questions about why this pattern hadn't been addressed before now. My friend texted that things were getting heated and Colton's dad was turning red in the face. Then Caitlin Rivers, who was the newest board member and didn't owe Colton's dad any favors, stood up and started talking. My friend said Caitlin absolutely destroyed Colton's dad in front of everyone. She talked about how his son had been allowed to create a culture of fear where students didn't feel safe in their own hallways. She said the district's liability insurance would probably drop them if they didn't take immediate action because this was a pattern of behavior that administration knew about and ignored. She pointed out that if Haley's family decided to sue, the district would probably lose, and it could bankrupt the entire school system. Caitlin said every parent in the district deserved to know their kids were safe, and right now she couldn't honestly say that was true. Other board members started piling on, asking why nobody had reported this pattern to them before. Dr. Foster explained that building principals were supposed to handle discipline issues, but clearly that system had failed in this case. Someone asked where Mr. Vaughn was, and Dr. Foster said he'd been instructed to remain available by phone, but wasn't invited to this particular meeting. My friend said Colton's dad looked like he wanted to crawl under his chair and disappear. The board voted unanimously to suspend Colton immediately pending a full investigation into the pattern of behavior. They also voted to bring in an outside investigator to review how the district handled student safety complaints. Colton's dad tried to argue, but got shut down by Caitlin, who reminded him that his son had assaulted the superintendent's daughter on camera, and he should probably stop talking before he made things worse for everyone. The meeting ended around 8, and my friend said people in the audience were actually clapping when the board announced the suspension. I felt this weird rush of satisfaction, knowing Colton was finally facing real consequences, but also this growing guilt about using Haley to make it happen. The next morning at the school felt completely different from any other day I could remember. Teachers were actually standing in the hallways during passing periods watching students instead of hiding in their classrooms. Mr. Vaughn was walking around with this tight expression on his face, telling people to slow down and keep their hands to themselves. Students were moving through the halls carefully like they were afraid of getting in trouble for the first time ever. Everyone was talking about the board meeting and what it meant for Colton. Some kids were celebrating openly, saying he finally got what he deserved. Others looked nervous, like they were worried about getting caught for their own bad behavior now that the rules were actually being enforced. Colton's friends were nowhere to be seen near their usual spots by the gym. I saw them scattered around campus individually, looking uncomfortable and avoiding eye contact with anyone who might ask about Colton. Brittany was sitting with a completely different group of girls at lunch, and when someone asked about Colton, she loudly announced that she'd broken up with him over text last night. She started telling everyone that she'd always thought the pushing thing was mean, but felt pressured to go along with it because Colton was her boyfriend. Other kids who used to laugh at Colton's pushes were suddenly acting like they'd never found it funny and had always felt bad for his victims. It was amazing how fast people turned on him once it was safe to do so. I was walking to 4th period when Mrs. Rodriguez appeared next to me in the hallway. She didn't say anything at first, just fell into step beside me like we were going to the same place. Then she gave me this look that made my stomach flip, because it was knowing and complicated. She squeezed my shoulder as she walked past, and I swear she had this tiny smile like she'd figured out exactly what I'd done and respected the strategy even if she couldn't say so out loud. That afternoon, the investigation started expanding beyond just what happened to Haley. An announcement went out during last period saying any student who had experienced or witnessed physical harassment should report to the guidance office to give a statement. The line outside the guidance office stretched down the hallway. Kids were actually coming forward with stories about Colton pushing them over the past 2 years. Some of them had injuries that needed doctor visits, but their parents had been told by Mr. Vaughn that it was just roughhousing and accidents happen. One girl I barely knew came up to me after school and showed me documentation her mom had kept. She had photos of a badly sprained wrist from last spring when Colton pushed her into a door frame during passing period. Her parents had complained to Mr. Vaughn, who told them kids roughhouse and Colton didn't mean anything by it. Now she was taking all that documentation to the district office because apparently the outside investigator wanted to see everything. More stories kept coming out over the next few days. A sophomore had gotten a concussion when Colton pushed him down the stairs. A freshman had chipped a tooth when Colton shoved her face first into her locker. A junior had twisted his ankle badly when Colton pushed him during PE class. All of them had complained to teachers or administrators, and all of them had been told to toughen up, or that boys will be boys, or that it was just an accident. The district's insurance company got involved because of all the potential liability claims. They sent someone to review security footage and apparently found dozens of incidents showing Colton pushing students with teachers or staff members visible in the background doing absolutely nothing. The insurance investigator compiled a report showing that adults witnessed Colton's behavior regularly and failed to intervene or document it properly. That report went to the board and to Dr. Foster, and suddenly everyone in administration was very concerned about proper incident reporting procedures. Mr. Vaughn got called into a meeting with Dr. Foster and the board that lasted 3 hours. When he came out, he looked shaken and pale like someone had threatened his entire career. After that meeting, he started being extremely concerned about student safety and made announcements about proper hallway behavior and reporting procedures. He personally stood in the hallways during every passing period, watching students and writing up anyone who so much as bumped into someone else. Teachers who'd ignored Colton's pushing for months were suddenly hyper-aware of any physical contact between students and filing incident reports for everything. The whole culture of the school shifted in less than a week from ignoring problems to documenting every tiny issue. Colton's suspension stretched from days into weeks while the district's legal team reviewed everything. His dad stopped showing up to board meetings and then sent a resignation letter that cited family commitments and business obligations. Everyone knew the real reason was damage control, because having his son expelled while he sat on the board would make the district look even worse in potential lawsuits. The resignation got accepted immediately, and suddenly there was an open board seat that nobody wanted to talk about. Students whispered about it in the hallways, and teachers acted like nothing had changed, even though everyone could feel the shift in power dynamics. The investigation kept expanding with more students coming forward and more documentation piling up in Dr. Foster's office. Security footage got reviewed frame by frame showing incident after incident that staff members had witnessed and ignored. The insurance company's report got thicker every day with new liability concerns and recommended policy changes. Mr. Vaughn started looking nervous whenever he walked past groups of students, like he was afraid someone would file another complaint about him specifically. I got called out of third period English class by a student aide who handed me a note saying, "Doctor, Foster wanted to see me in her office." My stomach dropped because this felt like the moment she'd figured out what I did. I walked to the district office building trying to prepare explanations that wouldn't make me sound like a manipulative person who used her daughter as bait. The secretary told me to go right in and Dr. Foster was sitting at her desk with a folder open in front of her. She looked up and smiled, which threw me off because I was expecting anger or disappointment. She thanked me for coming and asked me to sit down. Then she said she wanted to thank me personally for being such a good friend to Haley during a difficult time. I relaxed slightly, but stayed alert because this could still be a trap. Dr. Foster asked how long Colton had been targeting me specifically, and I realized she genuinely didn't know the full extent of what had been happening to me personally. I told her everything starting with the destroyed art project from junior year. I explained how Colton made me his favorite target after that and pushed me every single day for months. I described the failed complaints to teachers and the meeting with Mr. Vaughn where he told me boys will be boys. I talked about the constant anxiety of walking through hallways and never knowing when I'd get shoved into a locker or down the stairs. Dr. Foster listened with this tight expression on her face, like she was physically holding back anger. She took notes on everything I said and asked specific questions about dates and witnesses. She wanted names of every teacher who saw incidents and did nothing. She asked about documentation I might have, like photos of injuries or texts to friends about what happened. I gave her everything I could remember, including the dates of my complaints to Mr. Vaughn that went nowhere. By the end of my explanation, Dr. Foster's jaw was clenched and she was gripping her pen so hard her knuckles went white. Dr. Foster asked why I hadn't come directly to her office with my complaints instead of going through building administration. I explained that students don't really have access to the superintendent's office, and I didn't even know that was an option. I told her we're always taught to follow proper channels, which means going to teachers first, then counselors, then the principal. Going over everyone's heads to the superintendent seemed like something that would get me in trouble for not following procedures. I mentioned that other students had tried reporting problems to the district office before and got sent back to their building principals who then did nothing. Doctor. Foster closed her eyes for a second like she was processing something painful. She said the system had failed me and other students badly by creating barriers instead of access. She promised immediate policy changes to create direct reporting mechanisms that would bypass building administrators when students felt unsafe or unheard. She looked genuinely upset in a way that seemed personal and not just professional. She said no student should have to strategize about how to get help or worry about following the right procedures when they're being hurt. She talked about how the system was designed to protect administrators and the district instead of protecting students. She promised new policies within 2 weeks, including an anonymous online reporting system that would go directly to her office and an outside investigator. She said every report would get a response within 24 hours and students would get updates on what actions were being taken. She asked if I would be willing to serve on a student advisory committee that would help design these new systems. I agreed, because it felt like something good could come out of all this mess, even though I still felt guilty about how it happened. My phone buzzed during lunch on Friday with a text from Haley asking if we could meet at the library on Saturday like usual. I stared at the message feeling anxious about facing her after everything that happened. Part of me wanted to cancel and avoid the conversation, but that seemed cowardly after she'd been the one who got hurt. I texted back saying yes and asked what time. She responded with our normal meeting time like nothing had changed. I spent the rest of Friday and all of Saturday morning feeling sick with worry about what she would say. I kept rehearsing explanations in my head, but none of them sounded good enough to justify what I'd done. I got to the library 15 minutes early and shelved books in the children's section to keep my hands busy. Haley showed up exactly on time wearing jeans and a sweater with her new glasses that looked almost identical to the ones that broke. She had a small bandage on her forehead, but otherwise seemed fine physically. We started our usual routine of shelving returned books and helping kids find what they needed. She was quieter than normal and didn't laugh at the funny book titles we usually joked about. We worked side by side for almost an hour before she finally spoke about what happened. She asked if I knew Colton would push her when I suggested she visit the school that day. Her voice was calm, but her hands were shaking slightly as she shelved a picture book. I froze with a book halfway onto the shelf because I didn't expect her to figure it out so quickly. She kept talking without looking at me and said she'd been thinking about everything all week. She mentioned how I specifically told her what time to visit and where Colton usually hung out. She pointed out that I suggested wearing a visitor badge, which made her look like a regular student instead of someone important. She said the timing was too perfect for it to be a coincidence that her mom came around the corner right after Colton pushed her. Her voice got tighter as she listed all the details that didn't add up to an accident. She finally turned to look at me and asked directly if I set the whole thing up knowing she would get hurt. I considered lying for about 3 seconds but couldn't do it to her face after everything. I admitted that I knew Colton pushed people in that hallway during that time period. I said, I thought if Dr. Foster saw it happen to someone she cared about, then she would have to do something about it. I explained that I'd tried every proper channel and nothing worked, so I got desperate. My voice came out shaky, and I couldn't look at her while I talked. I said I knew it was wrong to manipulate the situation, but I didn't know what else to do after months of getting hurt with no help. I told her I never wanted her to get injured, and I was sorry she got caught in the middle of my plan to stop Colton. Haley got quiet, and her face went through several expressions I couldn't read. She asked if our whole friendship was just about using her to get revenge on Colton. Her voice cracked slightly on the word friendship, and I felt worse than I had all week. I swore that wasn't true, and our friendship was completely real from the start. I explained that I started volunteering at the library, genuinely wanting to help kids learn to read. Meeting her was random, and becoming friends were real. I admitted that once I knew who her mom was, I did take advantage of the situation, but everything before that moment was honest. I said I valued our friendship and hated that I damaged it by being manipulative. I told her she had every right to be angry and never talk to me again, but I wanted her to know the friendship itself was never fake. Haley closed the book she was holding and placed it carefully on the shelf. She looked at me with this expression I couldn't quite read and said she needed time to think about whether she could trust me anymore. Her voice stayed calm, but I could see her hands shaking slightly as she picked up her backpack. She walked toward the library exit without looking back, and I just stood there between the shelves feeling completely frozen. The automatic doors slid open, and she disappeared into the parking lot. I sat down on the floor right where I was standing because my legs suddenly felt too weak to hold me up. The children's section was empty since it was late afternoon, and the reading program had ended an hour ago. I stared at the colorful alphabet posters on the wall and felt like absolute garbage. Colton had been pushing people for months and deserved consequences, but Haley didn't deserve to get hurt just because I wanted revenge. I'd manipulated someone who became a real friend and used her as bait to trap someone I hated. The worst part was knowing I'd do it again if I had to, because nothing else had worked to stop Colton. I sat there for maybe 20 minutes before finally getting up and leaving the library. The drive home was a blur, and I couldn't remember a single song that played on the radio. The next week at the school felt strange because everyone was talking about the investigation. Dr. Foster had brought in someone from the district office to review everything related to Colton's behavior. Students were getting called to the main office to give statements about what they'd witnessed over the past 2 years. I got called in on Tuesday morning and spent an hour telling the investigator about every push I could remember. She took detailed notes and asked specific questions about dates and locations and whether any adults had been present. By Thursday, the hallways were buzzing with rumors about what the investigation had found. Someone said they'd reviewed security footage going back 18 months. Another person claimed they'd interviewed over 40 students. Friday afternoon, the announcement came through during last period. Colton was expelled effective immediately for repeated physical harassment and creating an unsafe environment. The statement mentioned full documentation of the pattern going back 2 years and violation of multiple district policies. Students started texting each other before the announcement even finished. Colton's friends looked shocked, like they never actually believed he'd face real consequences. I sat in my history class staring at my textbook and feeling this weird emptiness instead of the victory I'd expected. The district moved fast after that. Within a week, they announced new policies requiring staff to report any physical contact between students immediately, regardless of whether it seemed serious. They created an anonymous reporting system that went directly to district administration instead of building principals. The new system had a phone number and online form that bypassed all the people who'd been ignoring complaints for months. Dr. Foster sent an email to all families explaining the changes and apologizing for the failures that had allowed Colton's behavior to continue unchecked. She specifically mentioned that student safety was the district's top priority and they were implementing immediate reforms. The email got shared on social media and local news picked it up. Suddenly, Jefferson High was the example of a district taking student harassment seriously after years of looking the other way. Several teachers got written reprimands for failing to report Colton's behavior. My art teacher was one of them, and she looked embarrassed every time I saw her in the hallway. The music teacher got reprimanded too, along with 2 PE coaches who'd witnessed pushes during class and done nothing. Mr. Vaughn got reassigned to a district office position away from direct student contact. The official reason was restructuring, but everyone knew it was because he'd dismissed complaints and told students to make friends with their bullies. A new assistant principal started the following Monday and spent her first week meeting with student groups to hear about safety concerns. The whole administrative culture shifted almost overnight once board politics stopped protecting people who ignored problems. I should have felt victorious watching all these changes happen. Colton was gone, and the system that protected him was dismantled piece by piece. Students were safer, and adults were finally being held responsible for ignoring harassment. Everything I'd wanted to achieve had happened. But mostly I just felt empty sitting in classes and walking through hallways that no longer felt threatening. Colton faced consequences, but I'd damaged a real friendship to make it happen. I'd manipulated someone innocent and put her in harm's way to get revenge on someone guilty. The victory felt hollow because I knew what I'd done to achieve it. Haley's hurt expression when she figured out I'd set her up kept replaying in my mind during classes. I'd wanted justice, but the cost turned out to be higher than I'd expected. My parents noticed I was quieter than usual at dinner that week. Mom asked if everything was okay at the school and I said it was fine. Dad mentioned I seemed distracted and asked what was wrong. I couldn't explain the whole situation about manipulating the superintendent's daughter to expose a bully, so I just said I was dealing with friendship drama. They exchanged that parent look where they communicate without talking, and Mom said teenage friendships could be complicated. Dad told me to give it time and things would work themselves out. They seemed satisfied with that explanation and went back to talking about normal family stuff. I pushed food around my plate and nodded at appropriate times while thinking about how I'd probably destroyed the best friendship I'd made in months. Haley didn't text me for 2 weeks. I kept checking my phone hoping to see her name pop up, but nothing came through. I wanted to reach out and apologize again, but figured she needed space to decide if she could forgive me. Every Saturday, I went to the library hoping she'd show up for her volunteer shift, but she never did. The coordinator mentioned Haley had taken a break from volunteering and didn't know when she'd be back. I shelved books alone and thought about all our conversations about anime and true crime podcasts. We'd spent hours talking about theories and character development, and now that was probably over because I'd used our friendship as part of my revenge plan. I typed out apology texts a dozen times, but deleted them all because words felt inadequate for what I'd done. At the school, things were genuinely better without Colton. Hallways felt safer, and students weren't constantly looking over their shoulders waiting to get pushed. People walked at normal speeds instead of hurrying past certain areas. The trophy case hallway near the gym became just another hallway instead of a danger zone to avoid. Teachers were actually enforcing behavior rules now that board politics weren't protecting anyone. Students reported problems, and adults responded immediately instead of making excuses. The anonymous reporting system got used constantly during those first few weeks, as people reported incidents they'd been too scared to mention before. The new assistant principal took every report seriously and investigated thoroughly. Jefferson High was becoming the kind of school it should have been all along. Other students who were targeted by Colton started talking to me. Some approached me directly in the cafeteria or hallways to thank me for finally getting him stopped. A sophomore told me Colton had been pushing her since freshman year and she'd given up reporting it after teachers did nothing. A junior mentioned his parents had considered transferring him to private school because of Colton's harassment. They seemed grateful that someone had finally found a way to make the system work. But others gave me these knowing looks like they sensed something more complicated had happened. They thanked me, but their eyes showed questions they didn't ask directly. I accepted their thanks and felt guilty because they didn't know I'd manipulated an innocent person to achieve the outcome they were celebrating. Mrs. Rodriguez pulled me aside after class on Friday. She closed the classroom door and said she was proud I'd found a way to make the system work when it was failing students. Her approval meant something because she'd been the one teacher who never tolerated Colton's behavior. She mentioned she'd suspected someone would eventually force the administration to face consequences for their negligence. She didn't ask directly if I'd orchestrated what happened, but her expression suggested she'd figured it out. Her pride in my actions should have felt good, but instead, it made the guilt about Haley worse. Mrs. Rodriguez saw me as someone who'd fought back against injustice, but I knew I'd crossed lines that shouldn't be crossed. I thanked her and left the classroom feeling more confused than ever about whether the ends had justified the means. 3 weeks went by without any messages from Haley, and I kept checking my phone hoping to see her name pop up. I drafted texts apologizing again but never sent them because words felt empty after what I'd done. Finally, on a Tuesday afternoon, my phone buzzed with a message from her asking if we could meet up and talk. My stomach twisted into knots as I typed back saying yes, and we agreed to meet at the coffee shop near the library on Saturday morning. The week dragged by while I wondered what she wanted to say and whether she'd decided our friendship was over for good. Saturday morning, I showed up 15 minutes early and sat at a corner table picking at a muffin I couldn't really eat. Haley walked in right on time, wearing jeans and a hoodie with her hair pulled back, and she looked tired, like maybe she hadn't been sleeping well either. She ordered a hot chocolate and sat down across from me without saying anything at first. I waited for her to start talking because this was her meeting, and I didn't want to make things worse by saying the wrong thing. She stirred her drink for a while, then looked up and said she'd been really angry about being used as part of my plan against Colton. Her voice was steady, but I could hear the hurt underneath it. She said she understood why I felt desperate enough to do what I did, but she wanted to know if I'd considered any other options before involving her. The question hung in the air between us, and I knew I had to be completely honest this time. I admitted I should have tried going to her mom directly, or gotten my parents involved with pushing the school board to take action. I told her I took the manipulative route because I was angry and wanted Colton to face immediate consequences instead of going through proper channels that might take forever or lead nowhere. Saying it out loud made me realize how selfish my thinking had been. I'd been so focused on making Colton pay that I didn't care who got hurt in the process, as long as it wasn't me. Haley listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for another minute. Then she said what hurt most wasn't even the fact that I used her, but that our whole friendship now felt questionable. She said she kept going back through our conversations and interactions, wondering which parts were genuine and which were strategic moves to get closer to the superintendent's daughter. Her words hit hard because I knew exactly what she meant about not being able to trust your own memories of something that felt real. I leaned forward and told her everything about our friendship, except the very first decision to start volunteering at the library was completely real. I said I genuinely liked hanging out with her and talking about anime and true crime podcasts and all the random stuff we bonded over. I explained that once I got to know her, she stopped being a means to an end and became an actual friend, which made what I did even worse because I betrayed someone I cared about. Haley stared into her hot chocolate for what felt like forever, and I sat there barely breathing while I waited for her response. She finally said she wanted to try continuing the friendship, but needed me to promise complete honesty going forward about everything. No more manipulation or hidden agendas or using people to solve my problems. I agreed immediately and apologized again for betraying her trust and putting her in danger just to get revenge on someone who deserved consequences, but not that way. She nodded slowly and said, rebuilding trust would take time, but she was willing to try if I was serious about being a better friend. We finished our drinks and made plans to meet at the library the following Saturday like we used to do. Walking out of the coffee shop, I felt lighter than I had in weeks, even though I knew our friendship would be different now. The next few weeks were awkward as we tried to find our rhythm again. Our conversations felt stilted at first, like we were both being extra careful not to say the wrong thing. But gradually, things started feeling more natural as we fell back into talking about new anime episodes and debating theories about true crime cases. Haley would sometimes make comments that showed she was still processing what happened, but she never threw it in my face or made me feel worse than I already did. Meanwhile, at the school, things were changing in bigger ways than just Colton being gone. One morning during announcements, the principal said Dr. Foster was creating a student advisory council that would report directly to her office about safety concerns and other issues affecting students. The announcement said she wanted students from different grades who could represent various perspectives and experiences. After school that day, I got called to the main office and my heart started racing, thinking maybe I was in trouble for something. Instead, Dr. Foster was sitting in the conference room with some papers spread out in front of her. She asked if I'd be interested in joining the advisory council, since I had first-hand experience with how the system failed students who tried to report problems. And I said yes immediately because maybe this was a way to help fix things properly, instead of through manipulation and revenge schemes. She smiled and said the first meeting would be next week, and she was counting on council members to be honest about their experiences, even when it meant criticizing how the school handled situations. The first advisory council meeting happened on a Wednesday after school in the library conference room. There were about 12 students from different grades, including some seniors I recognized from the hallways, and a few freshmen who looked nervous to be there. Dr. Foster started by explaining she wanted to create better systems for reporting harassment and bullying after realizing how badly the school had failed students like me. She said the council's job was to share experiences and develop recommendations that would actually work, instead of just looking good on paper. One by one, students started talking about their experiences with unreported harassment and bullying that went way beyond just Colton. A sophomore girl described a group of seniors who cornered her in the bathroom and made fun of her weight every day for months, while teachers walked past and did nothing. A junior guy talked about being shoved into lockers by football players who thought it was funny to target smaller students. A freshman shared how she got sexually harassed in the hallways, and when she reported it, the assistant principal asked what she was wearing that day. Listening to all these stories was eye-opening because I'd thought Colton was the main problem, but really he was just one symptom of a much bigger issue. The school had created a culture where students with money or athletic status could do whatever they wanted while everyone else had to just deal with it. Over the next several meetings, we worked on developing specific recommendations for better reporting systems that wouldn't get buried by building administrators who didn't want to deal with problems. We suggested an anonymous online form that went straight to Dr. Foster's office instead of through principals or assistant principals who might have reasons to protect certain students. We recommended mandatory training for all staff about recognizing and responding to harassment instead of just looking the other way. We came up with consequences for administrators who ignored legitimate complaints, including having to explain their decisions to the school board in public meetings. Dr. Foster took notes on everything we suggested and asked questions about what would actually make students feel safe reporting problems. She didn't dismiss our ideas or tell us we didn't understand how schools worked. Instead, she treated us like we had valuable insights because we were the ones living with the consequences of the broken system. By the end of the semester, she'd started implementing changes district-wide based on our recommendations. The anonymous reporting system went live and started getting used constantly as students reported incidents they'd been too scared to mention before. Right before winter break, I heard through some former classmates that Colton's family was moving to a different district. Apparently, his dad found a job in another city and they were leaving over the holiday. One of his old friends mentioned Colton would be enrolling in a private school where his dad's money and connections still had influence. Part of me felt satisfied knowing he had to leave and start over somewhere new without his reputation protecting him. But another part worried he'd just become someone else's problem at a school where administrators might be even more willing to look the other way for the right price. At least he wasn't my problem anymore, and Jefferson High could move forward without the constant threat of getting pushed into lockers or trophy cases. The hallways felt different now, with students walking at normal speeds instead of hurrying past danger zones. Teachers were enforcing rules they'd ignored for years. The culture was shifting from protecting bullies to actually supporting students who spoke up about problems. It wasn't perfect, and there were still issues to address, but things were genuinely better than they'd been in a long time. I knew the changes came at a cost, though, because I'd manipulated someone innocent to force the system to work, and that knowledge would stick with me, even as Jefferson High became a safer place for everyone else. Right before winter break, Haley texted me asking if we could meet for coffee. We sat in a booth at the place near the library, and she stirred her drink for a while before speaking. She said she'd been thinking about transferring to Jefferson for second semester. I asked if she was sure because the whole incident was still pretty fresh. She nodded and explained that watching her mom actually fix things instead of just talking about them made her want to be part of that change. She said private school felt safe but also isolated from real problems. At Jefferson, she could see the improvements happening and maybe help keep them going. When second semester started, Haley showed up on the first day wearing jeans and a Jefferson hoodie. Seeing her in the hallways felt strange because every time I looked at her, I remembered setting up that moment with the trophy case. She joined my friend group at lunch and everyone liked her immediately. She was funny and easy to talk to and genuinely interested in what people had to say. By the end of the first week, it felt like she'd always been there. The Student Advisory Council met every month in Dr. Foster's conference room. We'd grown from the original 6 students to about 15 as word spread that Dr. Foster actually listened to what we said. Students started bringing up issues beyond physical harassment. Someone mentioned teachers who made racist comments disguised as jokes. Another person talked about the lack of accommodations for students with learning differences. A girl shared how the dress code targeted female students way more than male students. Dr. Foster took notes on everything and assigned staff members to research solutions. She never dismissed concerns or said we were being too sensitive. Instead, she treated every issue like it mattered because it affected students. One afternoon, I was walking to my locker between classes and realized I wasn't scanning the hallway for threats. For months, I'd been constantly aware of who was around me and where the nearest escape route was. The anxiety had become so normal I didn't notice it until it was gone. I could focus on my own thoughts instead of tracking everyone's movements. I could walk at a normal pace instead of hurrying to avoid dangerous spots. The mental energy I'd been using to stay safe was suddenly available for other things. My old art teacher retired at semester, and the replacement was younger and actually seemed to care about student work. On the first day, she announced that any damage to projects should be reported immediately, and she'd investigate what happened. She said art takes time and effort and deserves respect. I started a new sculpture using wire and colored glass. Every day I worked on it, I felt confident it would still be there the next morning. Nobody was going to push me into it or destroy it for fun. The fear was gone, and I could actually enjoy creating something again. Every Saturday, Haley and I volunteered at the library together like we had before everything happened. We shelved books and helped kids with reading and talked about anime between tasks. Our friendship felt solid again, but there was this underlying awareness that trust had been broken and rebuilt. It wasn't quite the same as before, but maybe that was okay. We both knew what had happened and chose to move forward anyway. That felt more real than pretending nothing had changed. Sometimes she'd reference the incident casually, and I'd feel guilty all over again. Other times, we'd laugh about something completely unrelated and it felt normal. The friendship required more effort now, but we were both willing to put in that work. Spring semester brought news that 2 other districts were looking at Jefferson's Student Advisory Council as a model. Dr. Foster shared this at one of our meetings and said our work was creating change beyond our own school. She credited us with showing administrators that student voices actually mattered when given proper channels. Other districts wanted to implement similar systems where students could report concerns directly to superintendents instead of getting buried at the building level. Hearing that our work was spreading felt good, but also weird. We'd started this because Colton pushed people and nobody stopped him. Now it was becoming something bigger about how schools listen to students. In March, I got my acceptance letter to a summer art program at the state university. It was competitive, and I'd spent weeks on my application portfolio. Mrs. Rodriguez had written one of my recommendation letters, and when I thanked her, she said she'd mentioned both my artistic abilities and my advocacy work. She said colleges wanted students who created change, not just followed rules. Having both those things on my application apparently helped. The program ran for 6 weeks in July and August and would let me work in actual university studios with professional artists. I'd been worried about affording it, but the acceptance came with a scholarship covering most of the cost. Colton's name came up occasionally in conversations, but mostly as a reference point for how things used to be. Someone would mention feeling unsafe in a certain situation, and another student would say at least it wasn't like when Colton was here. The fear he'd created had been replaced with a culture where speaking up was encouraged instead of punished. Teachers enforced rules they'd ignored before. Students reported problems instead of just accepting them. The hallways felt different not just because Colton was gone, but because the whole system had changed. New students who'd never experienced his pushing couldn't quite understand what it had been like. They just knew Jefferson as a school where concerns got addressed. At the final advisory council meeting of the year in late May, we gathered in Dr. Foster's conference room one last time before summer. She thanked everyone for their contributions throughout the year. She specifically said that student voices had changed policies that adults had ignored for way too long. She admitted the system had failed students badly by protecting certain people because of their parents' positions. She said the changes we'd helped create weren't perfect, but they were real and measurable. Incident reports were up because students actually trusted they'd be taken seriously. Staff training had improved. The anonymous reporting system was used regularly. Other districts were copying our model. She looked around the room and said she was proud of what we'd accomplished together. Several students had tears in their eyes, including me. We'd started this because one person got away with hurting people for years. Now we'd built something that might prevent that from happening to others. After the final meeting wrapped up, Haley and I grabbed coffee at the place near school where we'd been going since she transferred. She pulled out her phone and showed me this true crime podcast convention happening in August at a hotel downtown. It had panels about unsolved cases and famous detectives, and even a workshop on starting your own podcast. We'd been talking about going for months but kept putting it off because of school stuff. She said we should finally do it now that summer was here, and we actually had time. I agreed immediately because it sounded perfect, and we both needed something fun to look forward to after the intense year we'd had. Haley started laughing and said, maybe we should start our own podcast about what happened with Colton and the school board. She suggested calling it Institutional Failure and Teenage Revenge Schemes, which made me laugh too, even though part of me felt uncomfortable joking about it. She said we could do a whole episode breaking down how systems protect bullies and what happens when students have to take matters into their own hands. I knew she was mostly kidding, but there was this edge to her voice that reminded me she still carried some anger about being used as part of my plan, even though she'd forgiven me. We spent the rest of the afternoon planning out the convention weekend and which panels we wanted to hit and where we'd eat between sessions. It felt normal and good, like our friendship had finally gotten past the worst of the damage I'd caused. Walking home later, I kept thinking about how things had turned out. Colton was gone and facing real consequences for the first time in his life. The hallways at Jefferson felt safer, and students actually believed their concerns would be heard now. The advisory council was making real changes that would help people long after I graduated. I'd gotten exactly what I wanted when I started this whole thing. But the path I took to get there compromised everything I thought I believed about doing the right thing. I'd manipulated someone who trusted me and put her in danger to achieve my goal. Haley became a real friend, but our friendship started with me using her as a tool for revenge. Justice happened, but it wasn't clean or simple like I'd imagined it would be. There was no moment where I felt purely good about what I'd done, because the cost was always sitting there in the back of my mind. I'd stopped someone guilty by hurting someone innocent, and that truth made the victory feel hollow, even when I looked at all the positive changes that came from it. Junior year ended with the usual chaos of final exams and yearbook signings and people making summer plans. I felt grateful for how different things were compared to the beginning of the year, when I'd spent every day looking over my shoulder waiting for Colton to push me. The constant fear was gone, and I could walk through school without that tight feeling in my chest. But I was still working through the complexity of achieving something good through methods I wasn't proud of. Haley's forgiveness helped more than I could explain, because knowing she understood why I'd done it made the guilt slightly more bearable. We'd built something real from the mess I'd created, and that mattered even if it didn't erase what I'd done. I knew I'd always carry the knowledge that I manipulated someone innocent to stop someone guilty. That truth would be part of me forever, even as things got better, and the school became safer, and students felt empowered to speak up. The changes were real and lasting, but so was the moral compromise I'd made to create them. Living with both those things at once was harder than I'd expected, but it was the reality I'd chosen when I decided to engineer Colton's downfall instead of finding another way.